I was in a physiotherapist yesterday, and giving blood, which I never gave, and they said once you've scanned the card, take a seat. So when I'd finished there, I said, look, I want to really thank you for giving your seats to me to take home. So I said, I'll be taking one with me. And they said, what do you mean? Well, you said take a seat. So I said, I'll take a seat, thank you very much. I know that's too deep for most of you. I know you're good. Shane, it's a great delight to have you here today. And I said to Shane this morning, I said, I just wish I was back when I was 25 or so years of age, where I had the intellectual, emotional and spiritual capacity to rethink everything about faith and the Bible, because just his insight, and as many of you know, I faced a great sort of crisis really in the reading of the Bible probably about 5, 6, 7 years ago, where I just could not any longer serve a God who was supporting genocide through the Old Testament. And so I waited to see him say, what do I do with all this? And he just explained it all to me and put me onto Peter Enns' book, The Bible Tells Me So. What a transformation that was for me. And, because when you get a bit older, you don't accept things like you used to accept. You start to think things a little bit differently, a bit deeper. And Shane has just been an absolute life flow of revelation and understanding for me. Shane, I'm so grateful that you're here. I mean, you could be standing in front of thousands of people, and you chose to be with us and with a handful of people here today. And I am incredibly grateful for that. I want you to stand. Let's honour, I think, one of the greatest Bible teachers that I know.
All right. Good deal. You guys can be seated. So let's journey a bit today. It's a pastor's day, which means that we should suspend any temptation we have to judge new information by whether we agree with it or not, right? Otherwise, how do we grow, right? So if I hand somebody a book and they come back to me and they go, I disagreed with that book. Well, you've missed the entire point. Like, the truth of it is that books aren't meant to be agreed with nor disagreed with. Books are meant to be wrestled with. Great teaching is not meant to be agreed with. If a sermon can be evaluated in the amount of time it took to deliver it, it's not a very good sermon. And sermons aren't meant to be agreed with nor disagreed with. Sermons are meant to be wrestled with. They're meant to be discussed. And how else do we change? So I want to share something. This is new teaching that I've just been working on personal growth and how to integrate new information into our world. And what do we do? I mean, this should be obvious, right? If the last 10 books you read, you didn't disagree with at all, then you're not growing. Because the very people who go, I'm not reading that, I disagree with it. The truth of it is that we should read more books and Google less books, right? Because normally they don't read the book, they just Google it, and they see what some plonker says about it, and then they go, well, I disagree with it, right? How could we grow if we don't do this? The only way to grow, this should be obvious, the only way to grow is to allow information we had not considered before into our world and wrestle. That diverse elements have to somehow bond. This is true from the beginning of time. Just think about something as basic as water. What makes water? Hydrogen and oxygen. So somehow two diverse gases bond and make a liquid that makes life possible, right? That's weird, right? Now think about what had to happen for water to come together. Hydrogen and oxygen had to put aside their differences, right? How oxygen had to say, you know what, I've got 6 electrons. I'm better than you. You only have 1, right? And hydrogen had to go, well, we're going to have to humble ourselves here and bond with something that has 6 electrons, has more than us, right? Because you need 8 electrons to make a stable element. So what happened is 2 diverse elements put aside their differences and chose to bond. And it takes 2 hydrogens, because they got 1 electron, and 1 oxygen to make water. 6 plus 2 makes 8. That makes a stable molecule. That's how growth happens. Now, once two diverse elements choose to put aside their differences and bond, now you don't have one new possibility, you have infinite new possibilities, because now you have an entire new molecule that can bond with lots of stuff. And that's the nature of growth in a nutshell. So I want to talk to you about personal growth in our first session today. This is going to go for about an hour, and then we're going to have lunch. All right, and we'll see how far we get. I refuse to be in a hurry on days like today. I'd rather be effective than fast. All right, and so let's talk about the nature of growth and the nature of making sure, like, if you feel a bit stuck, like, man, I haven't had a new thought in a while, right? If that's you, I want to try to solve that. All right, we're going to try to fix that, and because there might be something going on. Or if you're honest with yourself, if you're starting to worry that your preaching's boring, right? I'm going to try to fix that as well, because there might be a simple answer to that. And if you're wondering why you hate boring preachers, even though they're lovely and love God, if you're wondering why that is, I can help you explain that as well. All right? So let's quickly talk about, if you could bring that first slide up, let's talk about the nature of truth. All right? Now, the nature of truth operates on a Trinitarian structure. Okay? That means it has three parts. And if you remove any of the three, it's not less truthful. It's just less meaningful, okay? So something can be just as truthful, but lose its meaning if we remove any of the three legs, right? And so let's talk through these three slowly, because I really want us to get this. Like, when we use the word God, or we use the word truth, we tend to focus on one of these three, but actually the more meaningful truth is when we explore all three. So the first leg of truth is the literal, or the objective, right? Something happened. Somebody wrote something down. There's something that is grounded in this thing. It's literal. Now, let's be clear about this. Sometimes in Scripture, the literal is fiction. All right? So Western people confuse not literal with not true. But that's just not the case. If the original writer was writing a poem and we interpret it as a science book, it's a problem. If the original author was writing a poem and we interpret it as history, it's a problem. If the original author was writing history and we interpret it as poetry, that also is a problem. Like, if I took you to Israel and we asked the history expert, hey, could you take us to the farm where the parable of the prodigal son happened? The guy would be like, what the heck? It was fiction, right? So fiction is not less truthful because it's fiction. There's actually a lot of truth in the parable of the prodigal son, but it's not literal, it's fiction. Right? And so, but it's literal in the sense that somebody told the story. In this sense, Jesus. Jesus told the story. And so there's truth in that story, even though it's fiction, right? So when we look at the Scriptures, there's a literal nature to it. And that doesn't mean all Scriptures are literal. Please don't be in that camp. Good God, good luck with that, right? Good luck with that, right? So, but it's literal in the sense that somebody wrote the story of Jonah down. So somebody wrote the parable, somebody told the parable of the prodigal son, and then years later, the writers of the gospel said, that's probably worth including in our gospel, right? So somebody did something, and it grounds it in the literal. But all the power in truth is in the next level, which is in the symbolic, or the meaning of it, right? So it's not, this is why you're bored to tears if somebody wrote a 70-page manifesto proving Jesus literally died on the cross. Even if they proved it in a way that would hold up in the Supreme Court of New Zealand, you're still bored by page 2. Why? Because the power of truth is not in the literalness of it. The literalness grounds it. But the power of truth is in the symbolic nature of it, right? This is why, if we finished this session today and we took a break and we walked outside and there was a sober man, not a drunk man you'd understand. If there was a sober man going to the toilet on a New Zealand flag. So we walk out and forget the fact that he's going to the toilet in the parking lot when there's a perfectly good toilet. Set that aside. There's a sober person saying, this is how I feel about the New Zealand flag, and he's peeing on the New Zealand flag. How many of us would be upset? All of us. Why? It's just cloth and thread. The man's just peeing on cloth and thread. Like, who cares? It's just cloth. But no, it's not just cloth and thread. It's all that cloth and thread represents. It's the meaning of it, right? This is why all the power of truth is found in the meaning of it. And this is true in some profound things, even like something like resurrection, which is pretty important to our story, right? If resurrection is not true, it's not a very good story, right? A guy stands up against empire for the sake of the poor and gets killed. The end. Like, it's okay, but it's not a great story. It happens all the time. Resurrection changes everything. But is the power of resurrection in the literalness of it? No. Like, if all you care about is literal resurrection, why not just worship Lazarus? He rose first, right? But there's no such thing as Lazarites or Lazarene. Hey, we're the church of the Lazarenes. That doesn't happen, right? Why? Because the power of resurrection is not simply in the literalness of it. The power of resurrection is in the infinite exploration of what that means for our world. Like, death doesn't get the last word, Jesus does. Like, there could be new creation bursting forth in the middle of this one. Like, you can have fresh starts and clean slates and second chances right here, now, today. Like, you can be surprised by hope tomorrow because you never know what God might introduce to your today that changes everything for your tomorrow. Like, there is no place in Christianity for despair, the internal conviction that my tomorrow is simply a repeat of yesterday. Why? Because resurrection has invaded our world. Now that's better, right? That's a whole lot better than, let me prove to you Jesus actually rose from the dead and I found the tomb. What? No. What? No. It's all the infinite explorations of the symbolic meaning of it, right? This is why somebody could build a boat trying to prove Noah's Ark literally happened, right? And everybody secretly is going, right? Why? Because the power of the truth of that story is found in the symbolic. It's in the meaning. It's in the explorations of what does this mean for our world, right? So let me illustrate this with a baby, right? So let's say there's a pregnant woman, right? And it comes time for her to give birth. And so she goes to the hospital in Auckland, wherever women give birth, and she's in the delivery room, and she's there, and they're doing whatever they do, whatever. I've never seen it, right? And so, and then here comes the baby, right? Right there it is, right? And the baby comes out, and they do whatever they do, you know. They check the vitals, and they wipe it off, and they wrap it in a blanket, and then at some point they hand this newly fresh baked baby. They hand it to the dad, and let's say in this case it's a girl. So they hand the baby to the father, and the father holds the baby, you know, and he says, oh, she's the most beautiful girl in the whole wide world, right? Well, what if somebody else was in the room and they went, really? Prove that literally. Right? Well, you wouldn't even know what to say. You're like, what? I'm not talking literally. She has redefined beauty. Like, what do you talk about? What if Sheldon Cooper's in the room and he's like, actually, there's going to be a lot of girls that are prettier than her, and there's actually going to be a lot of girls that are uglier than her. She's going to be somewhere in the middle. If you're a truth teller, you should be saying, oh, she's the most average girl in the whole wide world, right? Well, you would even, that doesn't even make any sense. And what if two women give birth at the same time due to overcrowding? So it's two women in the same room at the same time. They both give birth at the exact same time. At the exact same time they get wiped off. At the exact same time they get handed to the fathers. And the exact same time, at the exact same moment, both fathers say, oh, she's the most beautiful girl in the whole wide world. Are these two people in conflict? No, why? Because they're both talking at the level of meaning. They're both talking at the level of meaning. And so there's the literal nature of truth, and then there's the meaning or the symbolic, and all the power rests in that. But the third level of truth, or the third, not level like it's 1, 2, 3, but the third leg of truth is the evental nature of truth. The evental nature of truth is something that has happened, and I've explored the meanings of that happening. And now that happening is not something that happened. It's something that happened that fundamentally shifts the way I see all other happenings after that, right? It's like the cross and resurrection is an event that happened. But for us, it's beyond that. It's an event that happened that fundamentally shifts the way we see all other happenings, right? And this is why you're so bored sometimes with good-meaning, good-hearted, well-meaning Christians who actually at the end of it, if you were to say, God, I hated that sermon. If someone said, well, what did you disagree with? You go, nothing. They told the truth. It just, God, it's so boring, right? This is why. This is why. You're going, I can't even comprehend how one can be that boring. And here's the reason why. Here's the reason why. Gone are the days where the focus should be on what someone believes. Rather, how we believe what we believe. It's the how we believe what we believe that matters more than the what. Like, are you kidding me? Like the what? Like as if Christianity is just an exercise of getting all the right thoughts in our head. If we could get all the right thoughts in our head, then we'll be okay. What? No, it's not what we believe. It's the how we believe what we believe. Like let's say you were watching a debate on YouTube. This would make you boring, but nonetheless. Let's say you were watching a debate on YouTube between a humanist and a Christian, okay? So a humanist is on one side and a Christian is on the other. And we've all seen this stuff, right? And I get asked to do it. I would rather watch paint dry than debate somebody on the what of belief. I can think of no more boring thing on the earth. So you got a Christian on one side and a humanist on the other, and the humanist is saying, this is why Christianity is crap, and this is what, right, everybody should be a humanist, and right? And the Christian is like, this is why humanism is crap, and this is why and now, follow me here. Let's say that both of them are so compelling that they both convert each other at the exact same time, right? So let's pretend for a second that the humanist is so compelling that the Christian gets converted, and the Christian is so compelling that the humanist gets converted, and this happens simultaneously. So simultaneously, the humanist becomes a Christian, and the Christian becomes a humanist. What's changed? Absolutely nothing. At the level of what, something has changed, but at the level of how, nothing has changed. Because if the humanist is the same kind of Christian that he was a humanist, he's just going to be a boring Christian standing up debating stupid stuff, right? And if the Christian is, unless the Christian becomes a different kind of humanist as he was a Christian, he's just going to be a humanist that stands up on stages debating stupid stuff. At the level of what, something has changed, but at the level of how, nothing has changed, right? So with truth, we have to have the literal nature. We've got to ground it in something. Then we need to explore the meanings. And then there's an eventual nature, something that fundamentally changes the way we see our whole world. Let's go back to the baby. The baby is born. Oh, she's the most beautiful baby in the whole wide world. Meaning. But let's say you're driving home. And on your way home, your neighbor 8 doors down, whom you've never met, there's balloons in their front yard. And by the balloons, they're blue, and by the balloons is a sign that says, "Welcome to the world, Billy." Now, you could make an assumption that that woman who lives in that house has had a baby boy, and his name is Billy. And you can fully affirm the literal nature of that new life without it meaning anything to you. Absolutely. Absolutely. But your baby isn't like Billy. Your baby, you affirm the literal nature of that life, and it means the whole world to you. But let's say you go home, and your social activity of choice is dart throwing. So every night you have your dart club, and you go to your dart club, and you drink a pint, and you throw darts, right? So you get a pint, you throw darts with your mates. You get a pint, you throw darts with your mates. So the first night back, you go out, and you're throwing darts and drinking your pint, right? Next night, you go out, throw darts, drink your pint. Third night, you go out, throw darts, you drink your pint. By the fourth night, your wife says, "Excuse me, we have a baby now." And you say, I know. And I fully affirm and I believe in the literal nature of that baby. And not just that baby means the whole world to me. But until that new life has fundamentally shifted the way you live your whole world, it's not less truthful. It's just less meaningful. And this is why you find so much preaching so boring. Because somebody spends 40 minutes proving something literally, or going through the literal nature of something, with no exploration of the meaning and no eventual application at all. What are we doing? The focus becomes, exclusively upon the what, at the expense of the how. And what our world is clamoring for now is so now how should we live? What does that mean? Okay, let's say Noah's Ark is literal. Okay, now what? What do we do? Let's say Noah's Ark is a poem. It was a tribal poetry in response to Babylonian scriptures in the Epic of Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Enuma Elish. So let's say it's that. Now what? Until we could go, wait a minute, this, and this. Like somebody asked me the other day, Shane, do you think Jonah's literal? I said, do you? He said, yes. I said, amen. Now what? Now what? Okay, it's literal. What are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with it? We're going to build a model of a fish that could possibly swallow a man and to prove to the world and be the most boring people on earth? Or are we going to explore the meanings of it and hopefully change some people's lives? What can we learn about this? Like, what can we go with this? So that's the nature of truth. Let's talk about another thing. Next slide. Then there's the nature of being. So the nature of being has three parts too. There's oneness, and then there's sameness. And those are not the same thing. Oneness, the scriptures affirm unity, but they do not expect sameness. So if we equate oneness with sameness, we have a problem. Because then that looks like if somebody's not exactly like we are, then there's us and them. There is no room for us and them thinking in Christianity. None. The finished work of Christ finished the work for all people. Paul says it this way in Ephesians 1. He says, the Spirit of the risen Christ is filling everything in every way. Yes, even them. And even that guy. Oh, and that one over there. Whether they can name it or not, it's a whole other thing. But the work of the Spirit of Christ. Who is living right now in New Zealand that the Spirit of the risen Christ is not at work in their heart? No one. So there's oneness without the expectation of sameness. And the problem with this is this is what stifles growth. Is when we expect oneness and then expect sameness to be oneness. It leads us to reading someone who's diverse from us and going, well, if I disagree with it, it can't be true. And then we stop our growth. Because the same people who won't read things they disagree with or won't read things that make them wrestle, they'll come to you 2 weeks later and go, I just feel stuck. I feel uncreative. Well, hang on. You're not engaging anything that's not like you. I had a good friend of mine, really good friend. He said to me, he said, Shane, tell me my biggest weakness. Now, that's an odd question. In your observation, tell me my biggest weakness. So my question was, seriously? Right? And he said, seriously, I want to know what you perceive as my biggest weakness. And I said, okay, tell me the last 5 books you read. And he said, are you saying I don't read? I'm like, no, I'm asking the last 5 books you read. We can add insecurity to the list of weaknesses, right? Right? He said, last 5 books I read was boom, 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 boom. And all 5 were books written by authors from his tribe, from his group of people. I said, right. I said, of the 500 pages, 600, 700, 800, 900, 1,000 pages, whatever you read, of the 1,000 pages you read, how much of it made you wrestle? Versus how much of it did you just close the book and go, amen, right? He said, well, all of it. I just went, amen. I said, that's the problem. That's why you're feeling a bit stuck. That's why you're not engaging. You say you believe in oneness, but what you're expecting is sameness, and that is not cool. That's not cool. It's not wrong. It's just not wise. It's just not wise because there's a multifaceted nature of being. So let's talk about it one other way. Next slide. There's belief versus imagination. Okay? So it's not what we believe. It's how we believe what we believe. It's not the literal nature of truth. It's the meaning and the eventual nature of it, right? Now, what is the bridge that gets us from belief to behavior? That bridge is often imagination. Often it's imagination. Doctrine is far less important than how we imagine that doctrine working out. Because our emotions will attach to our imagination of something more than the reality of it, right? So if you had, let's say you have a 16-year-old daughter and she's supposed to be home at 11:30 and it's 1:30 and no one's picking up their phone. Does your imagination go to the truth or does your imagination go to the worst case scenario, right? And your emotions will attach to the imagination, not what actually might be happening, okay? This is so important doctrinally, okay? It is possible to have an orthodox doctrine but a pagan imagination, okay? So we believe the right things, but the way we imagine it is actually pagan, right? Let me prove it. How many of us, and the answer to this is all of us, okay? I didn't want to confuse anybody. How many of us believe that God exists as three distinct people acting in such symbiotic unity that they appear as one? Okay, that's Orthodox Christianity since forever. From the 200s, it was called the Trinity. Before the 200s, it was called the perichoresis, which was the peri is a circle, perimeter, choresis is choreograph. They called it a divine dance, okay? That God is not a singularity. God is a relationship between three that is so symbiotic they appear in unity, right? Right, now think about that. Think about what that would require. That would require when to step up, when to step back, when to take your turn, when to promote somebody else. And that's exactly what you see in Scripture. Somebody says, Jesus, you're good. He says, oh, no, don't call anybody good except the Father. But then the Father exalts Jesus. And then Jesus points to the Holy Spirit, but then the Holy Spirit points back to them. And so you've got this divine dance of love. Actually, here's the thing, right? Here's the thing. Every word, every noun, every pronoun, and every verb in Genesis 1 defining God is plural. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The word is Elohim. It's plural. In the beginning, God's created the heavens and the earth. Let us make man in our image. Plural, plural, plural. Now, all of us believe that. But if I was to ask you, when you pray, what do you picture in your head? I've asked this all over the world. I've asked this to 10,000 people. When you pray, what do you picture in your head? Number one answer, I picture a guy on a throne. Well, that's Zeus. That's Apollo. That's Hermes. That's absolutely, yeah, and largely those people on a throne are white. So you believe in Trinity, but you picture a single white dude on a throne? You have an orthodox doctrine of a pagan imagination. Number two answer is, I picture a father. Yeah? Whose father? What kind of father? What sort of father is he? Is he tall? Is he short? Is he chubby? Is he nice? What kind of father do you picture? And they'll go, I don't know. So, like an ambiguous father. Sort of an ambiguous father, right? Which that would be a good song, wouldn't it? You're an ambiguous father. It's who you are. Right? Number three answer is Jesus. I picture Jesus, right? I'm like, oh, right. Which Jesus? Like Middle Eastern, sort of swarthy, hippie Jesus? Or like sweet-smelling of lavender and dial soap, white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, you know? Like the Jesus that shows up, you know, with an orange soda and wearing some Crocs, you know? Or the guy tramping the countryside in the desert, standing up for the poor. Which Jesus? You know, right? And here's the problem with all three of those answers. The problem with all three of those answers is they're all singularities, right? So here's my point. We believe Orthodox, but then we picture pagan, right? How do we ever expect to do that? Like this is another good example. How many of us would believe that all of us are forgiven by the finished work of Jesus? Yes, all of us, right? Right? We all believe that. But then how many of us in our imagination pictured ourselves guilty in the last week? So we believe we're forgiven, but we imagine ourselves guilty, right? And here's the thing. You're preachers. Let me help you with this, okay? Nothing has helped me preaching more than this thought. In preaching, almost never are you addressing belief. Almost never. Almost always, you're addressing someone's imagination of what that belief is. Almost always. It's almost never belief control. It's almost always imagination control. So when you say something and somebody gets mad at you, and you think, well, I didn't say anything wrong. Correct. And they don't think you said anything wrong. You didn't violate their belief. You violated their imagination of what they believe. Almost all preaching is shaping imaginations. It's forming a different imagination of how that truth works out, how that meaning works out. Let's think about it this way. This is why the greatest communicators on earth are very, very gifted at putting words to things people already know. Like they'll go, man, you just put words to things. I knew it, but I had no words for it, right? So because we can have a pagan imagination while having an orthodox doctrine. Like, think about it. How confronting would it be if for the next 30 days you replaced every time you were going to say the word God, you used the plural? Because Genesis 1 does. What if you said, isn't it good? Isn't it good that the presence of God, isn't it good they are here? Right? Now, would people believe that? Yes, but it violates their imagination. It violates their imagination. Because if God is a divine relationship between three, that fundamentally shifts the way we should live with each other. But if God's a singularity who takes sides, that's a whole nother thing, right? So we don't have a doctrine problem, we have an imagination problem, right? We have that. And then there's values versus behavior, right? So there's what we say we believe and what we actually probably authentically believe we believe. And then there's how that then plays out, right? So with that as the backdrop, let's take a look at some of these things and see where we go. Next slide. Since we are all one but not the same, how we navigate diverse facets with others matters greatly, right? Since we're all one, the same Christ is holding us all together, but none of us are the same. We have different preferences, different gifts, different talents. We have different ideas, and we have different imaginations of how those ideas work based on our bias, based on our background, based on what we were always taught, right? Right? I mean, like, I preach, now that I preach all over the world, I preach in some churches that if I said Genesis 1 was literal, they would be like, are you an idiot? What is wrong with you, right? But if I said in some churches Genesis 1's a poem, they'd be like, are you an idiot? What's wrong with you? And both are fully devoted followers of Jesus, right? And so if we're all one but not the same, and we have to consider, how does that person's imagination, it's normally not what they believe, it's their imagination of what they believe. And so how do we navigate that? How do we process difference while honoring oneness? This is the only way to grow. The only way to grow is to process difference, a lack of sameness, while honoring the oneness, the Christ that holds us all together. Let's say it this way. Next slide. This is an observation by a guy named Paul. He says, but I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. That's sort of a little bit of an insult, I think. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you're not yet ready, for you're still of the flesh. Now watch his definition of what it means to, now he's writing to the church here, like these are Christian people. Watch his definition of what it means for a Christian to be a person of the flesh. It's not what you think. It's not like they're out, sleeping with everybody or doing drugs or whatever we would say. Watch what it says. For even now you're still the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife amongst you, are you not of the flesh? Which leads me to this question. Let's just stop and wrestle with that for a second. Is there anybody in our world that we would secretly celebrate if they failed? Is there anybody in our thought that if, man, we would secretly celebrate if they fell over? Is there any pastor in your world that you're thinking, if I had the kind of money he's been given, I could do it too? Anything like that? Then we're people of the flesh. Just needing more milk, I guess. Next slide, watch this. For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not merely being human? What then is Apollos? And what is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Keep going. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, not the same. One. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. Now, let's explore some of the meanings of this. All right, next slide. The one serving Jesus is an interpreter of Jesus, not God himself. So all of us operate in gifts, right? And we should take that gift seriously, right? There's a subtle line between our interpretation of the master and being seen as the master. As pastors, we got to really watch that. We have the task to take our task seriously of interpreting the master very seriously without taking ourselves seriously. Like my gift happens to be teaching, and I take this very seriously. I was studying last night till at least 11:20. Part of it was because it took me 3 hours and 10 minutes to drive from the airport to Brent's house, right? Something happened and they shut the entire 20 freeway from 4 to 5. It was a disaster. It took 2 hours and 25 minutes to get from the airport to the city and then catch the 16 freeway out, right? It's a massive thing. So I was studying. I take this very seriously. I put a lot of thought into this. It would have taken me 10 to 12 hours with 4 researchers putting talks like this together. I take it very, very seriously. But I have to watch myself between taking my task seriously and taking myself seriously. Those are two different things. Because if we're not careful, what happens is when we say the word God, because I got to be honest, I'll make a confession to you. I got sick of the word God. And I felt bad about that. And I don't mean I got sick of God. I mean I got sick of the English word G-O-D. Right? I got sick of it. I got sick of how it was used. Boy, God was here. Boy, that was a God thing. Or God wasn't here. Or man, God's not in that. Or God would never do that. And I think as pastors, you could all admit, right, that no phrase on earth has caused you more pain than God told me. Right? And God just told me. God laid it on my heart. I got sick of it. I got so sick of it. And I'm going to help solve, if you agree with me or whether you do or not, I'm going to solve some of that for us today, right? Why I was sick of it. And here's the thing. If we take ourselves seriously, instead of taking the task of interpreting seriously, what we end up doing is when we say God, we just mean, all we mean is ourself with a giant megaphone. Right? So we use God as an exclamation point to make our point, right? So we go, so I'm against this, so God would be against this. And if you're for it, then you're not against me, you're against God, right? Right? So we just project God as a giant version of us. You know, I'm for this. So it's the fundamental belief that I'm so profoundly connected with the heart of God that my thoughts are his thoughts. You know? And then when we say God, we just talk about ourselves with a giant megaphone, right? So God often in that point becomes a projection. That God's just a projection of us. When actually God is best served being a projectile. Something that cuts through all of us and makes us wrestle, right? That's two different things. I think one question we need to ask is the way I use the word God a projection or a projectile? And we'll come back to that in a second. Next slide. The one working and watering brings all their energy in their interpretation in order to be effective. But then they must hand it all over and leave all the results with the master. So which leads me to this. Have you ever given yourself to the work only to be heard differently? They interpreted you differently than you interpreted the master. Maybe let's say it this way. Next slide. One person plants, one person waters, but only God makes it grow. This requires profound trust and ego work. Let's say it this way. None of us had the first word, and none of us will have the last word. The tension in the middle will determine how well we handle differences, right? So if we ever believe we had the first word, or if we ever start believing we'll have the last word, then if someone disagrees with us, our task becomes to convince them to come to our side. And here's the thing, right? Can we just be honest? I see myself of at least average intelligence, okay? And I would see you that way as well. Can we just be honest and think about it? Have you ever in your life, ever, been successful convincing someone to change who started with a conclusion? I never have. In my entire life, I have never been successful convincing someone to change their view if they started with their conclusion. Now, a discussion is defined by two people who suspend their conclusions and have a talk, right? Philosophically, it's called suspended space. Suspended space is, I'm coming into a conversation with you, I'm going to suspend my conclusion up here, knowing after the conversation I can safely just pick it back up and never change, right? But for the conversation, I'm going to suspend my conclusion in order to have a talk with you because you might change me. God might have you in my life to integrate something that I needed, right? I'm going to tell this story on Sunday night, which none of you will be here, so I'm going to tell it now because I think this illustrates taking your task seriously without taking yourself too seriously. I got an amazing opportunity to study with a top history expert in Jerusalem. I had done a conference with his son-in-law. His son-in-law loved what I said, got one of my USBs, took it home to Jerusalem, handed it to his father-in-law, who teaches the master's level history courses at the University of Jerusalem there in ancient history, okay? This guy lives in Jerusalem. If you're familiar with me at all, this is where I learned the stuff on the Pool of Bethesda, things like this, okay? So he rings me and says, I'd like you to come speak to my synagogue in Jerusalem, and then after that, I'll take you out for 4 days and study history with you till you're tired, right? So he said, let me be clear, I'm an academician, I'm not a tourist guy, I'm not going to be very entertaining, but if you're okay with academics, I'm your guy. And I'm like, let's do that, right? So we go out, first day, and within 10 minutes, he blows my mind. Like, oh, wow, blows my mind, right? Now, he speaks English, but he's not an English speaker. So my response to him blowing my mind was, really? Really? Now, I was blown away. He thought I wanted to argue. And I can see where he thought that. Now, let's be clear. I didn't want to argue. And let's be clear. If I did want to argue, who's going to win that argument? We're in Jerusalem talking about Israel history with the expert. Not disagreeing with him, but if I did, who had all the arsenal to destroy me? He does. He's forgotten more than I know. This guy is who I want to be like in conflict. Because here was his response. I said, really? Really? His response was, oh, shame. Peace between us is the most important thing. If one of us needs to be wrong, please let it be me. Well, I was confused, which made it worse because my response to that was, what? He said, oh, shame. Peace between us is the most important thing. If one of us needs to be wrong, please let it be me. If the world sees us in conversation, may the Christ that holds us both together be glorified more than I need to be right about anything. Would you let me be wrong so that the world could see Christ glorified in our conversation? Right, wrong, or indifferent, that's a child of God right there. Yep. Jesus said it this way, blessed are the peacemakers, for they're the sons of God. Like if I was to say to you, make a list of what makes you a son of God or a daughter of God, a child of God. Would our basic disposition in conflict make the list? But that was the first thing Jesus said about sons of God. Go look it up. First thing Jesus ever said about what it means to be a son of God is this, blessed are the peacemakers, for they're the sons of God. 34 verses later in the same sermon, that's called 2 minutes later, he says, don't just love your friends, love your enemies and pray for those who despitefully use you, so that you may be children of your Father who's in heaven. 3 verses after that, that's called 10 seconds later, he said, remember, be holy as the Lord your God is holy. The verse, be holy as God is holy, the context is not morality. The context is our basic disposition and how we treat people coming against us. Which leads me to this. Have we been holy? Have we been a son of God? Like we sing songs like, I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of... Really? How's our basic disposition in conflict? So I said to him, I said, dude, did you think I was arguing with you? He said, weren't you? And I said, okay, first, I humbly apologize and ask for forgiveness for my tone. I was not arguing with you. I was blown away. But he wasn't getting the metaphor, right? I was blown away. Then I'm stuck trying to find language, right? I'm like, I was amazed. And he went, you could see it click over. He went, were you amazed? I said, man, I was amazed. He said, he held his heart and he said, oh, good. Because I knew I was right about that. He said, but seriously, I don't need to be right about anything more than I would rather see the outside world see Christ in our conversation. Taking your task seriously without taking yourself too seriously. Next slide. How often does Jesus ask his disciples or audience, what do you think? Or how do you read it? In other words, Jesus wasn't the great answer giver. He was the one promoting wrestling. He was the one promoting process. They asked him some basic stuff. He's like, oh, what do you think? Like, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Pretty important question, right? Jesus is like, I don't know. What do you think? How do you read it? He says, well, I should do this and this. He goes, oh, that'll work. That'll work. Jesus met people where they were and allowed them to journey at their pace. Apparently, the vision Jesus had was a movement that allowed for diversity in the simple as well as the profound. Let's say it this way. Next slide. To set a table that the whole world can experience the risen Christ requires the interpreter's ability to embrace difference. In this story, there's Paul, Apollos, Peter, James, and John, who are all interpreting the Master differently. You'd have to suspend all intellectual authenticity to make a case that James and Paul agreed with each other. There is no way. They're saying the exact opposite things about justification and faith and works and all the rest of it, and yet it's all in the same Bible. Why? Because the Bible doesn't expect sameness. It honors oneness while also honoring diversity of interpretation. And that requires wisdom. See, when we expect the Bible to be our rule book, good luck. It doesn't operate well that way. It doesn't. You know, somebody said something to me the other day. They were like, Shane. And they thought I was the authority on this. Hey, Shane, what do you think about that guy in America saying that Jesus and the apostles unhitched from the Old Testament to spread the gospel to the world? And I could tell by their tone what their conclusion was. And I said, I don't know anything about it. And I didn't. They said, oh, this guy, he's a big guy, you know. He said that Jesus and the disciples unhitched from the Old Testament so that they could take the gospel to like Corinth and places like that. I'm like, sounds true to me. I said, but I'm willing to hear you out. He said, well, I live biblically. The whole thing. It's all God's word. I said, and you live by it? He said, yeah. I said, wow. I said, so would you support a constitutional amendment that adds the death penalty for people who don't take Saturday off? He said, well, no. I said, well, you unhitch from that. Your shirt's made of mixed cloth. You unhitch from that. Would you force my sister-in-law to marry me if my brother died? He goes, no. I said, well, you unhitch from that. Would you, if your friend told you they committed adultery, would you have them stoned? No. Well, you unhitch from that. What exactly haven't you unhitched from? And he went, huh, and walked away, right? What you have in this story is an honoring of oneness without an expectation of sameness. And I think that's what stifles growth, is when we expect sameness and we call it oneness. Let's say it this way. Next slide. All the difference is simply part of it as long as three things are true. One, God is the ground of being. And what I mean by that is God is the source of all things. Everything breathing air is held together by God. This is a very big idea in the New Testament, that by him and for him and through him all things are created, and in him all things are held together, right? He is filling everything in every way because that's the only way life is sustained. It's that kind of thing, right? That God's the ground of being. 2, Jesus is the face of God and at the center, right? I love the way Richard Rohr says it. He says, if God is Trinity and Jesus is the face of God. In other words, Jesus is the part of God that we can see and study and understand, right? If God is Trinity and Jesus is the face of God, then God is benevolent and is on your side. I love that. I love that. I love that. And the finished work of Christ is what unites us. So if those three things are there, then differences are easy. You just sort of let somebody be where they are, right? Next slide. See, people have asked me, how do you preach for them when they say this? Right? So last year, I got to do the Seventh-day Adventist State Conference. So cool. Like, I was the first non-Adventist to ever be asked in their history. And they've asked me back. Right? People say, they do Sabbath. So what? Is Jesus the Christ? He was crucified, the resurrection is true? Yes, then they're my brothers. So what? I don't care what day they worship, whatever. You kidding me? They don't believe in hell. No, they don't. They don't believe in a God that tortures people for 6 billion years. Tends to work for them. So what? So what? So what? I'm doing a citywide Catholic conference in August, right? I've done the AOG National Conference in this country. Next year I'm doing the Elam National Conference, right? I've done the International Conference for Equippers, Shout, at the big basketball arena, right? Like I can hang with all these people, but why? Is that a weakness or is that a strength? Right? Why? Because if I'm expecting sameness, then I'll never be able to grow with people. But if I can honor oneness without expecting sameness, that's the key to growth. Any institution that doesn't allow for diversity and questioning is a cult. That's called a cult. Right? It's all one. And if the outside world sees how we interact with people a little different than us, let Christ be glorified more than our position needs to be right about something. Right? Next slide. The resurrected Christ is our solid center. This should free us to handle all sorts of difference and diversity. This should free us to discuss ideas without attacking people. Can we discuss ideas without attacking them? That's a whole other thing. I'll let you in on something, right? A year and 1 month ago, I made a decision to fast for 365 days from arguing about the Bible. It is the best decision I ever made. I'm telling you. It saved me 100 hours. And here's the thing. I'm not really given to arguing. I've been doing this 16 years. In 16 years, 4 people have taken me on. To my face, right? 4 in 16 years. It's a pretty good effort, right? I'm not really given to argue. What happens is I get put in positions where I have to referee arguments. So it's like, Shay, he says this, they say that. What say you? And it's a little bit flattering because somebody thinks you know. Right? It's an ego thing, right? But I just won't do that anymore. And here's why. Philippians 2 says, do all things without grumbling or arguing. How clear is that? Romans 14 says, never, ever, ever argue over a disputable matter. And then it calls all things disputable, right? The function is don't argue. Like, what are you doing? And then in Romans 14:23 it says, whatever faith you've come to in Jesus on disputable matters, keep it between yourself and God. The actual Greek there is shut up, right? Right? And so now when I'm put in those positions, I just go, hold on. Is Jesus the Christ who was crucified, the resurrection is true? Yes. Then I am conscientiously opposed to entering into your toxic argument. Would you please excuse me? And I'm going to leave it with you. And I hope the two of you see the irony at some point of arguing about a book that literally tells us don't argue about it. To talk about ideas without... An argument, by the way, if you're looking for a good definition of argument, an argument is any conversation where one or both people start with their conclusion. When it's that, no. Next slide. See, acknowledging the dis-ease that the diversity or disagreement creates in us. So as soon as we acknowledge, this makes me uncomfortable. There's 2 possibilities. 1, someone's wrong and I need to round the troops to prove my point over theirs. Right? Or 2, I'll just separate myself and have nothing to do with the person causing me the dis-ease. The problem is, is that the diversity isn't always what it appears to be. Let's say it this way. Next slide. Sometimes disagreement is not what it appears to be. Sometimes disagreement is a poison that needs to be extracted. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes disagreement is the bud before the blossom, right? Like when I was a teenager, I used to work for a grass cutting company. And when you first start with a grass cutting company, your first job is the weed eater, right? And it's horrendous. It's where I decided to get an education, right? I was like, I am getting lots of university. I am not doing this unless I own the company, right? And I made that decision at 15 years old, walking around apartment buildings, because the lawnmower can only do certain amount. You got to go get. So my job was, and this was such a big apartment complex, it took us 2 full days to do this. So I'm talking about 8 hours a day, 2 days, walking around buildings, getting the grass from around places the lawnmower couldn't get, right? And you just go mind numb doing this, and your hands get, and I was walking around this building, and there were 3 purple weeds. And I just right around. 20 minutes later, the owner of that apartment comes out screaming at the owner. He cut down my purple passions. He cut down my purple passions, right? Evidently, there's a plant called a purple passion that takes forever for it to blossom. But when it does, it's very quick and beautiful, you know? And I just thought it was a weed, and I cut it down. And I've never forgotten it because it cost me a week's pay to replace her purple passions to plant more, you know? And they're very expensive, evidently, right? So sometimes the disagreement is a weed, but sometimes that dis-ease is a purple passion. And if you just wrestle with it long enough, it'll create a whole new you, right? Like as a guest preacher, I come into places with the goal of challenging people 2 degrees, right? Because if I don't challenge people 2 degrees, I'm ineffective. Why would they have me? But I don't want to ever go past 5 degrees. Because 5 degrees of change topples the whole thing, and I'll lose my ability to even speak to the people, right? So there's a sweet spot between 2 and 5 degrees. And hopefully I've made you a little uncomfortable. A little, 2 degrees uncomfortable. But that uncomfortability is what we need to wrestle with for us to change. If we're not willing to do that, it's a problem, right? Sometimes we cut down the purple passion just before it blossoms, thinking it's a poison because we feel uncomfortable. Let's say it this way. Next slide. So there's 4 ways to handle new information. These are the 4 ways. I'm using this as a food analogy. So there's 4 ways to handle a food you've never tried before, right? 1 is just eat the thing. Just go for it. I was in Singapore and they gave me durian, right? I said, you must try this. I was like, okay, try anything. And you had to eat that fast because if you let it get to you, something about it, man. It's like a banana custard that smells like feet, right? So first is just to consume it. Second is to vomit it. So it makes me uncomfortable, I'm throwing it up. No! So we can consume it, we can vomit it. The third way is to tolerate it. Now what that looks like is this. That's not too unlike what we are. We'll let you hang out. You're not too unlike what we are. We'll tolerate you and your new idea, right? Or the fourth way is to accommodate it, right? Is to say, you know what, it's not so unlike, I'll try little bits. I'll just try little bits. So there's 4 ways to handle new information. Consume it, vomit it, tolerate it, or accommodate it. Here's the problem with all 4. All 4 put you in charge of what truth is. All 4. All 4 starts with the notion, if I hadn't thought of it, it's not true. What I think true is now must be true. And so your new information has to go through my filter of truth, and that will stymie our growth. Instead of judging new information, what if we disciplined ourselves to be judged by it? That would be a better way to live, assuming everyone is our teacher, assuming everyone has something to share with us, assuming I haven't thought, like this should be obvious, right? Somewhere walking the earth today is the rightest person about God, right? Right? He might be in Fangaray, I don't know, right? Somebody walking the earth today is the rightest person, male or female, somebody out of 7 billion people is the most correct person about God. I'm talking about the person God looks at and goes, I'm almost impressed, right? That person. Now, whoever that person is, what percentage of the fullness of God do they know? Maybe 1/10 of 1%? Let's go with that. 1/10 of 1% is the rightest person, which means everybody else is below that, which is why you're so bored when people who understand less than 1/10 of 1% of God start arguing about their position as if it holds any weight at all. Actually, the key for transformation in life is for all of us to honor oneness without expecting sameness and integrate that new information by being judged by it. I have a friend who pastored a church in Belfast, and he had an evangelism team. And here was their job. His evangelism team went out to the streets of Belfast to be evangelized. Right? So they'd find a Mormon and they'd go, come on, tell us why we should be a Mormon. They'd find a Muslim and say, come on, tell us what it's like to be a Muslim person. Tell us what it's like. Tell us why we should be Muslims. Tell us why. And what would happen is they wouldn't convert. Converting people who've already started with their conclusion, very difficult to do. But they would become better Christians because they now understood the other better. Here's one of the things he did. I love this. He set up confession booths around Belfast. You got to think about Belfast, Catholic, Protestants, right? He set up confession booths around Belfast, right? And invited the public to confession. But when they came in, it was them confessing the sins of the church to them and asking for forgiveness. Like, it's this kind of stuff. Like, this is how we grow. Next slide. Let's say it this way. I love this is a quote by Thomas Merton. Disagreement and diverse interpretation is often the elixir that moves the former version of ourselves to a better version. If the you from 10 years ago saw the you of today, obviously with no context and growth, if the you from 10 years ago saw the you of today and did not think you were a heretic, then you aren't growing. So true. If the you of 10 years ago saw the you of today and didn't think you were a heretic, you're not growing. And I would add to that, you're boring. So boring. Next slide. So, great teaching is not meant to be agreed with or disagreed with. It's meant to be wrestled with. So let's wrestle with this a little bit. Is this a weed or a budding blossom? So the new information, not necessarily from today, but what you're reading, what you're thinking about, what you've just been confronted with, is it a weed or a blossom? Am I fixing to cut something down just before it flowers? Or do I ignore or escape dis-ease to the point of stifling my own growth? See, if it makes me uncomfortable, I'm not even engaging it. Well, that'll stifle our growth. Do I set myself up as the filter of assimilation? In other words, if it's new information, I'm the filter for what's true and what's not, right? Instead of being judged by it. In that sense, we start speaking of God as super being, the super version of ourself, right? And that's a problem, right? Is Christ the solid center? Is Christ the solid center? Is there another slide? Yep. Can we trust the center's work in our lives to move us to a better version of what we are meant to be? Can we trust that God is bringing people into our lives who've had thoughts we haven't had, that if we just acknowledge the dis-ease and move with it, that one day we'll be a totally different person? Because here's the thing, man. Once we start speaking of God as just a bigger version of ourselves, the problem with that is we promise the world something that God doesn't normally deliver, and that is meaning. So here's what we do. We go, well, if you just understood God like I understand God, your life would have meaning. No, it won't. Because God does not give meaning. God is what renders all things meaningful. That's two different things, right? Sort of like love that way. Does love have a meaning? Try to define love. Very difficult. Love does not have a meaning. Rather, love is that which enters into your world and renders all things meaningful. You can have everything, but if you don't have love, you can't help but experience your life as meaningless. But you can have nothing, and if you have love, you can't help but experience your whole life as meaningful. That God is not that which has meaning. God is that which renders all things meaningful. Let's say it another way. God is that which what enters into what we think meaning is and bursts it wide open. That actually God is not meaning. God is trauma. Let me explain that. A trauma is anything that you experience that doesn't fit how you thought the world worked. So it's traumatic. right? And normally it's negative things. So if you walked into your house after going on a business trip and your house is empty and your wife is gone, that's trauma, right? If you saw a big adult punching a kid, right? You would say, man, I was traumatized by that. That was traumatic. Or if you were part of an earthquake, right? You know, that's not supposed to happen. I'll say, you're like, man, that was traumatic. A trauma is anything we experience that doesn't fit a file folder in our brain for how things are supposed to work, right? In that sense, God is trauma. He's the opposite of meaning. He's the thing that turns what we think meaning is upside down. Let me give you an example. A God that washes people's feet instead of expecting to be served himself, that's traumatic. Oh, a God that cares for the poor who could do nothing in return for him, that's traumatic. A God that forgives sins without any ritual before, that's traumatic. A God that forgives people who just tortured him, that's traumatic. A God that is still loving and forgiving after they wrap his head and mock him and spit, right? That is traumatic. That is traumatic. That when God engages people's world, he is not meaning, he is trauma. He is trauma. Like God is not the Band-Aid of meaning that we put over our traumas. God is the trauma. God is that name we give to the experience of, boy, that didn't fit. Boy, that did not fit. If somebody was to say, what's the church's role in Auckland? I would say the church's role in Auckland is to be trauma. To be traumatic. To be the experience for our world that turns, when somebody deserves your retaliation and you give them love instead, that's traumatic. When someone can't pay for the medicine you just gave them, that's traumatic. That is traumatic. That when we are the trauma, then we're the presence of God for our world. For our world. So I'm going to stop right there and give my new friend from Laidlaw some time to speak. In the breaks, we have a table set up over there. CDs, DVDs, USBs, direct downloads. Anything you want, I can make it appear on your phone. You can have a USB that's bundled up. You could do all kinds of things over there. 100% of what we make from that, we give to the poor and the afflicted to be the trauma. Okay, so we look after children who have mental disabilities and physical disabilities in China. 2 in Hinyang, 1 in Changsha, the orphanage is there. We also have a rescue home in Cape Town that gets girls out of sex trafficking, off drugs, high school educated, and job trained to break the cycle of poverty in the Cape Town flats. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this thought. If you want to grow as a person, you have to be willing to be uncomfortable enough to see if it's a weed or if it's a blossom. Keep going. Honor oneness without expecting sameness. And then you can integrate new information. Okay? Grace and peace, everybody.
I had a direct impact of what he just taught when I did Julie Schnook's funeral. And I had a pastor come up to me, a senior minister, and he said, that book that you recommended me to read, I disagree with it, philosophically, doctrinally, intellectually, psychologically. I mean, and he did it loudly so everyone around him could hear. And I just walked away from him and thought, what an idiot. Well, you know, because I'm getting redeemed now by Shane, but it was just exactly the issue that he's talking about here. See, and I just thought that was brilliant. Shane, thank you very much. Why don't you come up and share? We used to do the Laidlaw Internship program in the church and dumped it. It was too intellectual and it was too hard. And we've now adopted it again, and you're going to share with us the reason why we've adopted it.
Okay. Well, I feel a little bit like you've just watched a really good Marvel movie or a really good doco, and then you get the ad part where you all kind of think sitting there like, I've had the coffee and I really need to go to the loo, and you get this advert and think, well, I hope this guy hurries up so I can have lunch and or make my way to the toilet. So I won't take very long. So as I said, I know this is a really nice space, and look, I'm really glad Shane is doing the Elam conference because I'm actually an Elam pastor, although I work at Laidlaw College. So I'm really looking forward to having you. That's really cool. And we're in for something really good because I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but I just really appreciate this, the posture in which you're putting yourself here is that we need to listen to others and be in a space and create that. You know, I think God is a God of hospitality in the sense that he invites us in. And, you know, our posture should be one that actually takes a step back or a step in to saying, I want to hear what you're saying, a gift of listening to the other. So I just love what you're saying, Shane. Fantastic. So Laidlaw College, I think just to say a couple of words to give it a bit of context. Laidlaw College is an old institution. It's nearly 100 years old. It used to be BTI, BCNZ, and now it's called Laidlaw College. So it's gone through these evolutions, you might say. It's an evangelical college, and I think this thing is, one of our lines is the Bible is our story. We're deeply committed to Scripture, to not in a fundamental way, but actually Scripture in all its entirety, and to think out that, and to find our world living out of that story, out of the notion of Scripture. So when I went there 25 years ago as a Elam pastor, I stepped out of pastoring and spent 4 years with my wife studying there, and it was the best thing that I ever did. To my discovery, I thought it was the best kept secret New Zealand had, because I knew nothing about it. I've always made contact with Laidlaw, and about 8 years ago we moved from Christchurch after pastoring a church to look after the internship program. So the question is, if I was sitting in your seat, the question I would be asking, putting myself in your seat, would be, as a pastoral leader, why would I be at all interested in Laidlaw's internship program? Well, this is not a sell for me. It's rather if I can tell you one story, and I've got a number of them, as we all do. As pastors, we always have stories to tell. But I'll tell you one story about a guy called Marlon. Marlon came to us in 2014. He was out of Life Church, went to Life Church. He could have gone through Life, and nothing wrong with Life's program at all, but he just wanted to learn the Bible better, because he had this deep sense of call that he wanted to teach his young people to read the Bible, to learn about the Bible, to soak themselves in it. So he chose and came to us. He did an internship. He started off, I didn't know a lot about Marlon, so he's half Niuan, half Māori. So he starts off, and as he's working through the year, you can sense a deep sense of call in his life to do this. But what we didn't know about Marlon was he had a serious health issue. As he got later in the year and as he progressed, actually, some of his studies dropped off. We couldn't figure out what was wrong. He kept on working through that until we found out actually he was dying, and he needed a liver transplant. So he, fortunately, as it came towards the end of the year, he had to stop his study, but he went to Auckland Hospital, had a liver transplant, and which is amazing in itself. But the amazing thing about this guy, Marlon, is that in the new year, and it takes a while to recover from something like that, he was back studying because of this deep sense of call to make a difference in his life for others. So he completed his studies, and I think through this I just was challenged by this commitment, this sense of call in his life to apply himself and to learn. Today, Marlon, he graduated today, which I think is a great story. Marlon is now the representative for the religious education schools for the whole of Auckland. Recently talked to him, and he's putting these fantastic programs together. And he said to me, my time doing this just really helped me learn how to integrate my understanding about Scripture, about the Bible, about all things in terms of theological ideas, about who God is. Not that I'm constantly learning, but I've actually got some sort of base, firm foot to put my own to think out of. In other words, imagination. He caught this idea that actually to learn and step back and to be disciplined in terms of our learning gives us theological imagination. So what's internship about? It's a partnership. It's a partnership between the church and a place like Laidlaw, an institution that's dedicated to actually training and learning. So the internship is, in terms of partnership, it's about actually the church and the institution working together. So we have a couple of models around that. We underpin Arise's internship program and also Equipa's internship program. So the idea, one is like Nat, is he here? Down the back there. He's in one of my classes. But he's doing a 3-year degree. But that degree will help him in terms of learning about Scripture, learning in terms of about spirituality, how to look after himself, and elements of theology. But that's not just kind of learning and staying in a book. It's actually going into the context of ministry and saying, you know what? How do you do this stuff? And how do we think about this? Why do I do it this way? So it's not a case of just like how. It's asking the question, what's the why behind the how so I know the how's right? Sometimes we're all about, and I agree with Shane here about the how, but I'm twisting that a little bit by saying actually we've got to know not just enough how to do something, why are we doing it this way? Is there a better way to do it? And that leads into the sense in which of what I call theological imagination. I think one of the things that we desperately need in terms of, this is my own sense of conviction, in terms of the kind of climate and environment we're living in now. We would have never imagined 1 week ago the terrible events of Christchurch. And I feel quite emotional about it because I was there. I lived in Christchurch. I pastored in Christchurch. And I think that one of the things that we need is actually being able to really know how to respond wisely to the context that we're living in. And that takes us, we need a space in which to think deeply about our faith and deeply how we communicate. And in a sense of not just in our words, but in our posture to know, as Shane's been talking about this morning, how we conduct ourselves, how do we engage with the other, how do we talk with our Muslim our neighbours, and with the kind of those in a secular society that don't really understand this thing at all. We need people that are really thoughtful and thinking and wise to navigate where we're going and the challenges of this culture. So, listen, if you want to talk to me, I think I've been over 3 minutes now, so time to stop. I've got some materials. Love to talk to you. I'll be here over lunch. Let's make some space and I can catch and have a chat. Thanks, Brett. Thanks so much for giving me the space.
Pleasure. So look, we've got Nathan who did the coffees for you. He's doing the internship and doing it with Laidlaw. I just think they've changed it so much. I think it really works. And I'm going to be looking forward to seeing the results. So, it's a good thing to do. We've tried just about every other Bible college and every other internship type theological stuff that's around the country, and most of it has just got major flaws to it. I'm very happy with what's happening there. So please talk to Graham. We need to get our young people theologically equipped. There is, I think, a major issue in New Zealand at the moment of young people who just do not understand the Bible and have a good biblical theology. So let's have a talk to him. You might think that you haven't got any young people, so it doesn't matter. You've got older people that should be doing it. Number one, maybe you should be doing it. Number three, you might find some people who need to do it eventually. You need the information. God bless you. We got lunch there. If you want to just give a gift to help toward the expense of the lunch, we'd be grateful. If you can't afford to do that or don't want to do it, that's open.